Chapter 1. Girls, Girls, Girls. This is the story of four sisters. They lived in Boston in America during the Civil War. Their father was away helping the army, so they lived in the house with their mother and Hannah their servant. Margaret was the oldest. She was 16 and was very pretty. She had blonde hair. Her family called her Meg. Next came Josephine. She was a tall 15-year-old with long legs. She wished that she were a boy. Her family called her Joe. The third sister was Elizabeth. She was 13. She was a very quiet, shy girl. Her family called her Beth. The youngest sister was Amy. She was thin and had blue eyes. She thought she was very important and behaved like a lady. Their mother was Mrs. March, and they all loved her very much and tried to please her. She worked hard to help the army by making clothes. The girls called her Marmee. The March family did not have much money. They used to be rich, but Mr. March tried to help some friends and lost all his money. They still had their house and Hannah to help them, but their clothes were old, and sometimes they did not have enough to eat. Life was sometimes difficult, but they always tried to be happy and help each other. Christmas was coming, and Marmee told the girls that there was not enough money for Christmas presents this year. The girls had a little money and talked about what they would do. Each of them wanted to buy something for herself. Meg wanted something pretty. Joe wanted a new book to read. Beth wanted some music to play on the old piano, and Amy wanted some new pencils because she loved to draw. The clock struck 6. Marmee would be home soon. The girls got ready. They cleaned the fireplace and lit the lamp. They made sure that Marmee's chair was near the fire, and Joe held her slippers in front of the fire to make them warm.
Marmee's slippers are very old,
said Joe.
We should buy her a new pair.
This made them think. They decided that they would not buy anything for themselves this Christmas after all. They would buy some things for Marmee. Meg decided to buy some new gloves. Joe thought new slippers would be very useful. Beth wanted to give her some nice handkerchiefs.
I'll buy some perfume,
said Amy.
It won't cost much, and I can still buy some pencils for myself.
While they waited for Marmee to come home, they practiced their Christmas play. Joe wrote a play every year, and everyone thought it was wonderful. When Marmee arrived, they made her sit by the fire. They put warm slippers on her feet. After supper, Marmee read them a letter from their father. He was well and told his daughters to be good so that he would be proud of his little women when he came home. They all thought about the letter and decided to be very good. That evening, the girls took out their sewing. At 9 o'clock, they put away their work and sang some songs around the piano. Joe was the first one to wake up on Christmas morning. It was a strange feeling because there were no presents to open. Marmee had put a small book under each girl's pillow. As soon as they woke up, they began to read their new books. Then they went downstairs to their mother, but she wasn't there. Hannah told them someone came to the door asking for food, and she had gone out with them. The girls got their presents ready. Amy surprised everyone by hurrying off to the shop to buy a larger bottle of perfume. She said that she was feeling guilty for buying such a small bottle of perfume, but now she felt better. Breakfast was ready when Marmee arrived home. She told them that she had visited the Hummel family, who were very poor. The mother had a new baby and 6 other children. They had no food to eat and no fire to keep them warm. Marmee and the girls decided that they would give them their breakfast. They carried the food and some wood to the Hummel's house. They gave the food to the children, and Hannah lit a fire to keep them warm. When the 4 girls went home, they were hungry but happy. They knew that they had been good. They had bread and milk for breakfast, and then they gave Marmee her presents. She was very surprised and pleased. That afternoon, the girls put on their play for their friends. About 10 girls came to see the play. They got onto a bed and watched as the 4 sisters acted out Joe's play. It was about a witch and a bad man and 2 people in love. Everybody enjoyed it very much, even when part of the set fell down. At the end of the play, the bed broke and all the girls fell onto the floor. Nobody was hurt and they all laughed. When they went to have some supper, they were very surprised to see a lot of food on the table. They didn't know where the food came from until Marmee told them that it came from Mr. Lawrence. He was a rich man who lived in the house next door. The girls had met his grandson. They called him the Lawrence boy. Joe wished that she could get to know him better, but his grandfather made him study a lot. Mr. Lawrence heard about the breakfast that the March family gave to the Hummels and decided to reward the children with this food. They were very pleased and enjoyed it very much. A few days later, Joe was reading in her favorite chair near a sunny window. Meg called out to her and showed her a letter from Mrs. Gardner. It invited them to come to a dance on New Year's Eve, which was the next day. Meg was very worried about what she should wear. Joe laughed at her. She knew that they did not have much choice. Meg wished that she had something nicer to wear. Joe's best dress had a burn mark and a tear in it. Meg was worried that her gloves were not very nice. Joe's gloves had terrible marks on them because she spilled some lemonade on them. They decided that they would each wear one of Meg's gloves and carry one of Joe's. Then nobody would see the lemonade marks. Joe tried to make Meg's hair prettier, but she did something wrong and Meg's hair looked terrible. Beth and Amy helped to make it nicer. Marmee made sure they had handkerchiefs, and they walked excitedly to Mrs. Gardner's house. When they got there, a boy asked Meg to dance almost immediately. Joe stood against the wall. She did not dare to move because she was hiding the burn and tear marks on her dress. She moved along the wall and knocked into the Lawrence boy. He was not dancing because he did not know anybody. Joe talked about the wonderful feast that his grandfather had sent on Christmas Day. She discovered that his name was Theodore, but he liked it better if people called him Laurie. She also found out that he had been to Paris and Switzerland. He could speak French. He was 15 years old. He told Joe that he thought that Meg was very pretty. He invited Joe to dance, and she told him that she couldn't because of her dress. He took her out of the room to a hall where they could still hear the music, and there they danced. Meg came to find Joe because her shoe broke and she hurt her foot. She could not dance anymore. They wondered how they were going to get home because Meg's foot was badly hurt and she could hardly walk. Luckily, Laurie was ready to go home just then, even though it was early, and he gave them a ride in his grandfather's carriage. They told the two younger sisters about the dance. Meg wished that she could always go to dances in fine clothes and ride in carriages, but Joe didn't care. She thought they were just as happy as rich people anyway. Chapter 2. New Friends. After the excitement of Christmas and the New Year's Eve party, the girls went back to their usual lives. This is how they spent their days. Meg went to the King family, where she was a teacher for the younger children. The Kings paid her, and she was very happy that she could help her family with the money. However, she was sometimes envious of the older King girls. They had a lot of money, and often had new dresses and gloves. Meg wished that she could live like that, but she knew that she was poor. She thought that she would never have the nice things that other girls had. Joe also had a job, though she was only 15. She went to her very rich Aunt March and helped look after her every day. Aunt March asked her to wash the dog or read to her. Joe loved to read, but she didn't like Aunt March's choice of books. Aunt March was often annoyed, and Joe sometimes came home quite unhappy. Aunt March had a lot of books. Joe liked reading her favorites while Aunt March was asleep. Beth was too shy to go to school. Her father used to teach her, but he was at the war, and her mother was busy working. She taught herself as well as she could. She liked being at home and helped Hannah to keep the house comfortable. She spent a lot of time playing with her dolls. Some of them were very old, but she loved them all. She tried hard to make nice music on the old piano, but it was not a very good piano, and sometimes she cried about the noise it made. Amy went to school. She loved to draw, and the teachers complained that she drew pictures instead of doing her schoolwork. Amy loved to dress up nicely and wear good clothes, and she was often unhappy because her clothes were the wrong color. She had to wear them, however, because she had no others. On the day after the party, each of the girls spent their day in the usual way. That evening they were all at home together. Meg told them that there was trouble at the King home. One of the children told Meg that the oldest brother had done something very bad and his father had sent him away. Mrs. King was crying and Mr. King was talking very loudly. Meg was pleased that she didn't have any older brothers who would bring trouble to the family. Amy told them about Susie Perkins, who was wearing a beautiful ring at school that day. She wished that she were Susie Perkins so that she could wear lovely rings like that. Then Susie did something wrong at school, and the teacher was very angry with her. Suddenly, Amy stopped wishing that she were Susie Perkins. Jo had a story too. She was reading for Aunt March. It was a boring book, and Aunt March fell asleep. Jo began to read one of her favorite books. She came to a funny part and laughed. That woke Aunt March. She told Jo to read her book instead of the other one. Jo began to read it for her. Aunt March made her go back to the beginning. Beth went to the shop to get something for Hannah. A poor woman came in and asked if she could do some cleaning for the shopkeeper because she had no food to give her children that night. The shopkeeper refused. Mr. Lawrence was in the shop. He bought a large piece of fish and gave it to the woman. Marmee told them about an old man she met while she was making clothes for the army that day. He had 4 sons. 2 of them were killed in the war, 1 was a prisoner, and the last one was in the hospital. He was very proud that he could help his country in this way. The girls were sometimes unhappy because they weren't rich like they used to be. These stories helped them remember that they still had many things to be thankful for. Not long after that, Jo began to make friends with Laurie. He was sick, and she saw him looking out through the window of his large house. She thought he needed some friends. She began to talk to him, and he asked her to come in and visit him. Jo went in and talked happily with Laurie. He told her that he sometimes watched her family from his window.
"You always look so happy,"
he said. He was sad because he had no mother. Jo told him some funny stories, and Laurie laughed. Then he showed her around the house. Jo was excited to see the library. There she met Mr. Lawrence. She was a little afraid of him at first, but he was very kind. He told her that he knew her grandfather before he died, and said that her grandfather was a good friend of his.
"He was a brave and honest man,"
he said. Jo was very pleased. Mr. Lawrence saw that Laurie was happy to have a visitor. He invited Jo to come again and said that Laurie could visit the girls when he was better. As they went to the door, Jo saw a beautiful piano and asked if Laurie would play it for her. Laurie agreed, though his grandfather was not happy about it. Marmee told the girls that Laurie's mother was Italian and that his grandfather did not like her. Laurie was born in Italy, and both his parents died when he was very young. His mother played music, and Mr. Lawrence did not want his grandson to be like his mother. That's why he didn't like him playing the piano. Laurie and the girls became very good friends. He came to visit them often, and they went to the big house to see him. Mr. Lawrence came to visit as well, and soon they were no longer afraid of him. Only Beth was still afraid of him, and she was too shy to go into the Lawrence house. She wanted to go and see the wonderful piano, but she did not dare. One day, Mr. Lawrence came to the March house. He said that Laurie could not play the piano because he had more important things to do. He wanted someone to come and play it to keep it in tune. Beth heard him say this. She was very brave. She said she would love to come and play it. She played it almost every day. Mr. Lawrence secretly listened and made sure that she had good music to play. Beth decided to make him a pair of slippers, and the other girls helped her. A few days later, the girls were surprised when some men brought a small piano to the house with a letter from Mr. Lawrence.
"This piano belonged to the granddaughter I lost,"
he said in the letter. Beth was so pleased that she decided to go to the big house and say thank you. When Mr. Lawrence opened the door, she kissed him. Everybody was very happy. Chapter 3. Dealing with Anger. All the girls at Amy's school brought limes to eat. Her friends had given Amy some and she wanted to give them some back, but she had no money left to buy any. She got some money from Meg and bought a bag of limes to take to school. At school, she showed them to her friends and put them in her desk. They were going to eat them later. Amy decided not to give any to Jenny Snow because Jenny had made her angry the day before. Jenny was angry with her and told Mr. Davis, the teacher, that Amy had limes in her desk. Mr. Davis had told them not to bring limes to school, and he punished Amy. He hit her hand with his ruler and made her stand in front of the class. Nobody had ever hit Amy before, and she was very upset. She went home and told Marmee about it. Marmee said she could stay home from school for a while. She told Amy that she was wrong to bring the limes to school. However, she did not agree with Mr. Davis. She did not think that teachers should hit students. One Saturday afternoon, Amy found Meg and Joe getting dressed in their good clothes.
"Where are you going?"
she asked. They would not tell her. Amy guessed that they were going to the theater with Laurie and said that she wanted to come.
"I have my own money,"
she said.
"I can pay for myself."
Joe did not want to look after Amy while she was at the theater, so she told Amy that she could not come. Amy was very angry and cried. While Joe and Meg were at the theater, Amy took Joe's book of writings from her room and threw it in the fire. This book of stories was very precious to Joe. It had in it all the stories that she had written. When she came home and found out what Amy did, she was very, very angry. She shouted at Amy, but Amy did not care. That night, Marmee said to Joe that she should forgive her sister, but Joe refused.
"She was very, very bad, and she does not deserve forgiveness,"
she said. The next day, Joe went to the river with Laurie to skate on the ice. Amy followed them, but Joe pretended that she was not there. Laurie warned Joe to stay away from the middle of the river where the ice was thin. Joe heard him, but Amy did not. Joe saw Amy go towards the middle of the river, but she was still so angry that she did not warn Amy to stay away. Suddenly, the ice broke, and Amy fell into the river. Laurie saw what happened and rushed to help her. Joe helped too. They pulled Amy out of the water and put some of their clothes on her to keep her warm. Then they took her home. Both girls were crying. They were both very cold. When Marmee had put Amy to bed, Joe told her what happened. She knew that it was her fault, and that she could have stopped the accident if she had not been angry. She was very, very sorry. Marmee told her that she should learn a lesson from this.
"Anger can make you do very bad things to people you love," she said. "You must learn to control your anger."
Marmee explained that she also got angry easily when she was young, and she talked about it to her mother and father. When they saw her start to get angry, they spoke to her. This helped her to stop her anger before she did anything bad. Before Joe went to bed, she looked at Amy in her bed and gave her a big kiss. One day in April, Meg's good friend, Annie Moffat, invited Meg to stay at her house for 2 weeks. Sally Gardner, another friend, was also coming. Meg was very excited but worried about what she would wear. There would be a party and a dance while she was there, and she thought that her clothes were too old and plain. She enjoyed herself at the Moffats. She ate good food, wore her best clothes every day, and drove around in a nice carriage. The 3 girls went to the theater and to the opera. They walked and shopped and visited friends every day. Meg was keeping her second-best dress for the party and her best dress for the dance. On the evening of the party, she saw that the other girls were putting on better dresses than hers. She decided to put on her best dress. She still didn't look as good as the other girls, she thought. She was happier when some flowers and a letter came for her. The flowers were from Laurie. All the girls were excited about that. Meg was pleased that he had remembered her. The note was from Marmee, and she put it in her pocket. The girls thought it was also from Laurie. She broke up the flowers and gave all the girls some to put on their dresses. They all looked pretty. She felt a lot better now. She danced, and they asked her to sing. She was enjoying the party. Then she heard some people talking about her. They did not know that she could hear them. They said that Mrs. March was making plans for one of her daughters to marry Laurie because his grandfather was rich. Then they said that Meg would look very pretty if she had some nice clothes to wear. One of the girls said that they might try to give her something nicer to wear for the dance. Another one said they should invite Laurie to come to the dance. Poor Meg was very upset. She wanted to cry and go home and ask Marmee for advice, but she couldn't. She slept badly that night.
"We've invited your friend Mr. Lawrence to come to the dance,"
said Annie's older sister, Belle, the next morning. Meg said that he wouldn't come because he was too old.
"What do you mean?"
asked Belle, surprised.
"How old is he?"
Almost 70,
answered Meg, smiling to herself. They laughed.
"We meant the young man,"
said Belle.
He's only a little boy,
said Meg.
He's not old enough.
The girls were surprised because Laurie was tall for his age.
"What are you going to wear?"
asked Sally.
The same old dress again,
answered Meg.
"Why don't you send home for another one?"
asked Sally.
I don't have another one,
answered Meg. Belle noticed that this was difficult for Meg to say.
"You can borrow a dress from me,"
she said kindly. Meg could not refuse. The girls made her look very pretty for the dance. Laurie came, and when he saw her, he said that he did not like her dress. Lots of boys wanted to dance with her. She did the things her friends did. She drank champagne. She talked to the boys. She danced and laughed. The next day she was sick, and the day after that she went home. She told Marmee that she felt very bad about the dance. She wished that she had worn her own clothes and been herself. She told her what the girls had said.
Do you have plans?
she asked. Marmee told her that she did. She told them her plan.
I want my daughters to grow up to be good and happy people, whether they are rich or poor.
The girls agreed that this was a good plan. Chapter 4. At Work and Play. As the days grew longer and warmer, the girls went for walks and worked in their garden. They also played their games. One of their favorite games was to have a club where they met every week to talk about what they saw and heard. This was just like the Pickwick Club that they read about in a book. They also wrote a little newspaper for the club. At one of their meetings, they decided that Laurie could join the club as well, and he came to their meetings. He made a letter box between his house and the March house, and they often put things like garden seeds, books, and letters in it for each other. They didn't know that one day it would hold many love letters. At the beginning of June, Meg and Joe both had a long holiday. The King family went to the beach for 3 months, and Aunt March went to Plumfield. Both girls were very happy to have a rest from their work.
"What are you going to do?"
asked Amy. Meg said that she was going to stay in bed late every morning and do nothing. Joe said she was going to read books and play with Laurie. Beth and Amy decided they would stop their lessons too and rest like their sisters.
You may try it for 1 week,
said Marmee.
I think that you will discover that all play and no work is as bad as all work and no play.
The next morning, Meg came down late for breakfast. The house was untidy. Then she sat and thought about the dresses she would buy this summer. Joe played with Laurie at the river and then read a book in the afternoon. Beth began to tidy up her doll cupboard, but she got tired and went to play her piano. Amy sat in the garden to draw. She went for a walk and got wet in the rain. In the evening, they agreed that it had been a nice day, though it seemed quite long. Marmee and Hannah did the work that the girls usually did. The days became longer and longer, and the girls grew bored. By Friday night, each of the girls thought that it had been a very long week. On Saturday, Marmee decided to teach the girls a lesson. She gave Hannah a holiday and did nothing herself to see what the girls would do. She told the girls it was her turn to have a rest. They should look after themselves. The girls were quite happy about this. It felt good to have some work to do after their long, boring week. They made some breakfast for Marmee, but it tasted so bad that she couldn't eat it. Then Joe decided that she would cook dinner and sent an invitation to Laurie. Meg began to tidy the house. Beth began to cry because she forgot to give their canary any food or water. She found it lying dead in its cage. They decided to have a funeral for it. Joe went to the kitchen and began to wash the dishes and prepare dinner. The fire went out and she had to light it again. She went to the shop to buy some food, but she chose bad food. Sally Gardner came to visit Meg, and an old lady called Miss Crocker came to have dinner with them. Marmee went out. Jo worked hard in the kitchen, but she did everything badly. Some of the food was not cooked long enough, while some other food was cooked too long. Nobody could eat it. She put salt instead of sugar on the fruit. Jo was about to cry when she saw Laurie looking at her. He was laughing. They all began to laugh. They had some bread and butter. After dinner, they held a funeral for Pip, the canary. After the funeral, they all worked as fast as they could to clean the house. By evening, they were very tired. Marmee came home.
Would you like another week of doing no work?
She asked them.
No,
Was the answer.
Work is good for you, and play is good for you,
said Marmee.
You must have some of each in your life. That is how to make good use of time.
Yes, Marmee,
said the girls.
We won't forget.
And they didn't. Every day, Beth went to the letterbox that Laurie had made. She loved doing this job. One day, she came in with her hands full. Laurie sent some flowers to Marmee. Meg received a letter and a glove.
Why is there only one glove?
Meg said. Since the letter wasn't in Laurie's handwriting, it appeared to be from his teacher, Mr. Brooke. It translated a German song into English. Jo received 2 letters. One was from Marmee, who praised her trying to control her temper. The other was from Laurie, who invited all the girls to come and have a picnic lunch with him and the Vaughan children the next day. The Vaughans were visiting from England, and he wanted them to meet the girls. Mr. Brooke would come too, he said. The next day was bright and sunny, and the girls went to meet the Vaughan children. Kate was the oldest and was older than Meg. Fred and Frank were twins of Jo's age. Frank had a bad leg and had to use a crutch. Grace was 9 or 10 years old. Sally Gardner and her older brother Ned also came on the picnic. They rode up the river to Longmeadow in 2 boats. It was not far. They played some games on the short grass. Jo was angry when she saw that Fred Vaughan cheated, but she controlled her anger and won the game. Mr. Brooke called them all for lunch. They made a fire and they had a lot of very nice things to eat. They sat and talked and played games all afternoon and learned a lot about the visitors from England. Even Beth joined in and talked with Frank about animals in America and England. At the end of the day, they put everything in the boats and rowed back to Laurie's house. It was a lovely day for everyone. Chapter 5. Dreams and Disappointments. One day, Laurie saw the girls come out of their house and go through the back gate towards the river. They were carrying cushions, books, drawing paper, and sewing bags. He wondered where they were going and decided to follow them. They went to some trees and sat there drawing and reading and sewing. When Laurie saw them, he felt sad that he had no brothers or sisters. Beth noticed him and asked him to join them.
Why are you sitting here?
He asked. They told him that Marmee wanted them to be outside as much as possible during summer, but they remembered how important it was to work. That's why they decided to come outside to do some work. They invited him to work with them. He read to them while they drew and sewed. They looked at the beautiful view. Far away over the river there were mountains. The sky was blue. They talked about their dreams and hopes. Laurie wanted to travel around the world and then spend all his time playing music. Meg wanted to have lots of money and pretty clothes, with servants to do what she told them. Jo wanted lots of horses and books and lots of time to write. Beth just wanted to stay home safe with her father and mother and play her little piano. Amy wanted to go to Rome and be a famous artist. They decided to meet in 10 years to see if their dreams came true. Laurie was unhappy because his grandfather wanted him to go to college and become a businessman, but he didn't like business. He wanted to play music. The girls thought that his grandfather would change his mind and allow him to be a musician. In October, the days began to be colder and shorter. Jo sat in her room and wrote her stories. One day she took 2 of her stories and went into town to the newspaper office. She didn't tell anyone that she was going there. Laurie, however, was in a building across the road and he saw her. He surprised Jo and walked back home with her. She told him her secret about the stories. The man in the office said that he would read the stories, and if he liked them, he would print them in the paper. She was very excited. Laurie said he had a secret, too. He told her that he knew where Meg's lost glove was. His teacher, Mr. Brooke, had it. He kept it in his pocket all the time, but one day he dropped it and Laurie saw it. Laurie told Joe,
I think Mr. Brooke loves Meg and wants to marry her one day.
Joe was very upset by this news. She wished that Laurie had not told her. She didn't want anyone to take Meg away. Joe decided to play like a boy. She ran down a hill with Laurie. Meg saw them and told Joe that she should start behaving like a lady instead of a little girl. Then she told them about Belle Moffat's wedding. It was a beautiful wedding. Belle and her husband were going to Paris for a holiday. Joe asked Meg if she envied them. Meg said that she did.
That's good,
said Joe.
That means that you won't go and marry a poor man.
Meg wondered what she meant, but Joe would not say any more. For the next few weeks, Joe behaved strangely. She rushed to get the paper every morning. Sometimes she would go up to Meg and kiss her. At other times, she just sat and looked at Meg sadly. It was very strange. One day, the paper arrived, and Joe was very excited. The girls soon discovered that one of Joe's stories was in the paper. They liked the story very much and were very proud of their sister.
November,
said Meg,
is the worst month of the year.
She complained that she had too much work and not enough time to play. It seemed very boring to her. Beth looked out of the window. She saw Marmee coming through the front gate. Marmee came in and asked if there was a letter from Father. The mail had not arrived yet. The doorbell rang, and Hannah came in with a telegram. Marmee opened it. She read it. She fell into her chair as if she had been shot. She was white. Meg took the telegram and read it. This is what it said. Mrs. March, your husband is very ill. Come at once. Washington Hospital. Suddenly the whole world changed. The bright, sunny day became dark, and the room was full of crying. Marmee soon stopped.
I must go at once,
she said.
I hope it is not too late. Girls, help me to get ready.
She sent Laurie to send a telegram to Washington and take a note to Aunt March. She needed to borrow some money from her. She sent Joe to Mrs. King with a message. Beth had to go to Mr. Lawrence and ask for some bottles of wine for her father. Amy had to help Hannah get some things ready, and Meg had to help Marmee put her clothes in a suitcase. Everybody was very busy. Mr. Lawrence came in with Beth, bringing some wine and other things that Mr. March might need. He promised to look after the girls while Marmee was away. He said that Mr. Brooke would go to Washington with Marmee to help her. Laurie came back with some money from Aunt March. She also sent a note. It said that Mr. March should not have gone to the war. She hoped that they would take her advice next time. Marmee put the note in the fire and put the money in her purse. Joe took her message to Mrs. King and wondered what else she could do to help her father. She knew that Marmee needed money. She went to the hairdresser and sold her hair to him. It was beautiful hair, and she thought she looked very bad without it, but she got some money and gave it to her mother. Marmee and the girls were very surprised. They couldn't believe what she did. She did look very strange with all her hair cut off. Nobody slept very well that night. Early the next morning, Marmee and Mr. Brooke went to the station to catch the train to Washington. They went in Mr. Lawrence's carriage. Everyone was sad to see them go and hoped that Mr. March would soon be well again. How strange and empty the house was without Marmee in it. The girls did their best to continue their lives as usual. Meg went to the Kings and Joe went to Aunt March. Beth and Amy stayed home and helped Hannah in the house. They soon had news from Mr. Brooke and Marmee. Father was getting better. Mr. Brooke sent a letter every day, and Meg read them for everyone to hear. Of course, they all wrote to Marmee. Meg wrote about the girls and how they behaved. Joe wrote about an argument she had with Laurie and included a poem. Beth didn't write much, but told Marmee that she did not forget any of the little jobs she had. Amy wrote about her lessons and her clothes. Hannah wrote about the running of the house and told Mrs. March that everything was going well. Laurie wrote a note too, and even his grandfather wrote, offering any help that he could. Everyone hoped that Father would get well and that Marmee and Mr. Brooke would come home soon. Chapter 6. A Surprise Return. For the first week, the girls were very good. Everybody did their jobs without complaining. Everybody helped each other. Then they began to get lazy. Jo caught a cold because she forgot that she didn't have any hair and didn't wear a hat. Aunt March told her to stay home until she was better. Jo was happy about this and sat all day reading books and writing. Meg spent a lot of time reading the papers and writing long letters to her mother. Beth was the only one who kept busy doing all her little jobs. One day, Beth asked Meg to go and see the Hummels. Meg said she was too tired. Beth asked Jo. Jo still had a cold. She said she couldn't go to the Hummels.
Why don't you go?
Asked Meg.
I have been every day, but the baby is sick, and I don't know what to do,
answered Beth.
My head aches, and I'm tired. I thought one of you would go.
I want to finish my story,
said Jo.
I'll go tomorrow,
said Meg. They decided to wait until Amy came home from school. They would ask her to go. An hour later, Amy was not home. The girls were still busy with their clothes and stories. Beth put on her coat. She put some food in her basket and went to the Hummels. The air was very cold. She was feeling sick. It was late when she quietly came home and went to her mother's room. It was even later when Jo went into the room and found her sitting on a chair crying. Jo felt very bad when Beth told her that she went to the Hummels and the baby died while she was holding it. The baby had scarlet fever. The doctor came and said the other children had scarlet fever too. He told Beth to go home or she would get scarlet fever as well. Beth became ill. They didn't know what to do. The doctor thought she would get better soon. They decided not to tell Marmee because she needed to stay in Washington. Their father was worse again. They sent Amy to Aunt March so that she would not get sick. Amy didn't want to go, but Laurie said he would come and visit her every day. Beth became very ill. She had to stay in bed. She was very hot. She couldn't talk properly. She forgot the names of her sisters. Meg sat and watched her and realized that being rich meant having sisters who loved you. Beth lay in bed with one of her dolls. The doctor came twice a day. At the beginning of December it began to snow, and the wind was very cold. The doctor said that they should ask Mrs. March to come home. He was afraid that Beth would die. Jo was about to rush out to send the telegram when she met Laurie. Laurie came in to say that he had a letter from Mr. Brooke. Mr. March was getting better again. Jo told him what the doctor said about Beth. Jo cried and cried. Laurie held her hand and talked to her.
She must not die,
said Jo.
She is too good to die,
said Laurie.
Good people always die young,
said Jo. She began to cry again. Laurie had a surprise for her.
I sent a telegram to your mother yesterday,
he said.
Because I was worried. So was my grandfather. Mr. Brooke sent a telegram back to say that your mother would come immediately. She will be here tonight.
Jo could not believe it. She held on to Laurie. She laughed and cried at the same time. They were all pleased to hear that Marmee was coming home, but Beth was very, very sick. She lay in bed all day. The cold wind blew the snow against the window. Beth could not eat. Her face was hot and dry. The doctor came. He said that tonight she would either get better or she would die. He could not help her anymore. The girls sat with her all night. They prayed for her to get better as they waited for Marmee to arrive. She was very late. They worried that something very bad had happened in Washington. It was after 2 o'clock in the morning when Jo looked at Beth and saw that she had changed. She was not hot. The look of pain was gone. Her face was pale and restful. Jo bent down and kissed her. She thought Beth had died.
Goodbye, Beth,
she whispered. Hannah woke up. She felt Beth's hands and face. She sat down and cried.
The fever has gone,
she said.
She's sleeping.
The doctor came.
Yes, girls,
he said.
She is alive and she will live. The fever has gone. Keep the house quiet and let her sleep and rest.
Jo and Meg went out into the hall and hugged each other. It was a very long hug. Morning was very beautiful the next day. It was even more beautiful when Marmee arrived. While these things were happening at home, Amy was with Aunt March. It was difficult for her there because Aunt March did not know how to talk to children. Laurie came to visit her every day and often took her out to the theater or for a ride on his horse. Amy was friendly with Esther, Aunt March's servant. She was French and loved to tell Amy stories about France. Amy was also allowed to look at all the things that Aunt March had in her cupboards. She sometimes dressed in Aunt March's old clothes. Aunt March had some beautiful jewels and rings, and Amy liked to play with them. Esther was a good friend to her. She told her that Aunt March was going to give all her jewels and clothes to the 4 girls when she died. She showed Amy the little ring that was going to be hers if she was good.
I wish you would give it to me now,
said Amy, and decided to be very good. It was a beautiful ring, and she liked it very much. She thought about Aunt March's will, which told people what they would get when she died. She wanted to have a will, too. She wrote one. She asked Esther and Laurie to sign it. Laurie told her that Beth was very sick. Amy cried and hoped that Beth would soon get better. She suddenly didn't care about the ring. Marmee told the girls about their father and how he was getting better. Mr. Brooks stayed with him in Washington. That day was a very quiet but happy day. Meg and Joe made sure that Marmee had everything she wanted. Laurie went to tell Amy, who was so pleased that she forgot all about the ring. She wanted to go home to see her Marmee, but she could see that Laurie was very tired. She decided to write a note. While she was writing it, Laurie fell asleep. She let him rest. Then she was surprised because Marmee came to Aunt March's house to see her. Amy was the happiest girl in the world. Marmee saw that she was wearing a ring.
"What's this?"
she asked.
Aunt March gave it to me,
explained Amy.
She said I was such a good girl that she wanted me to have the ring now.
"I think you are too young to wear such a ring,"
said Marmee.
I want to wear it to help me remember something,
said Amy.
Every time I see it, I will remember not to be selfish.
Marmee listened to Amy's plan.
Beth is not selfish, and that's why everyone loves her,
said Amy.
I want to be more like her.
Marmee decided to let her wear the ring. That evening, Joe told her mother about Mr. Brooke and Meg's lost glove. Mrs. March listened carefully. Then she told Joe about Mr. Brooke, whom she called John.
"He was very helpful to us,"
she said,
"and we grew to like him a lot. He told us that he loved Meg, and he hoped that one day he would have enough money to ask her to marry him. You must not tell Meg about this, Joe. I want to see how Meg feels about him when he returns."
Why don't you tell him to go away and leave us as we are?
asked Joe.
We are so happy together.
Marmee sighed.
"It is only right that you will all go away from me one day,"
she said.
"We cannot stop time."
Chapter 7. Problems for Meg. Joe was not good with secrets. She didn't tell people, but everyone could see that she knew something that she did not want to tell them. Meg kept quiet. She thought that Joe would tell her one day. Laurie was not so patient. He tried to find out what it was, but Joe would not tell him. Then suddenly Meg changed. She seemed lost in her own thoughts. She was very quiet. She didn't eat much. She became annoyed easily. She blushed often. She was like this for several days. Then she received a letter. When she read it, she began to cry. She dropped the letter.
"What's the matter?"
asked her mother, running to her. Meg was very angry.
"How could you do it, Joe?"
she cried.
Me? I've done nothing. What are you talking about?
exclaimed Joe.
"You wrote it,"
cried Meg.
"and Laurie helped you. How could you be so cruel?"
She took another letter from her pocket and showed it to them. It was the letter from Mr. Brooke that was sent with the glove. Joe was furious.
Laurie wrote this,
she shouted.
"Did you answer it?"
asked Mrs. March.
"I did,"
replied Meg. Meg wrote back to Mr. Brooke and told him that she was too young to be in love and wanted to talk to her mother about it. She said she wanted to remain friends. She told them she received this letter from Mr. Brooke. He wrote to say that he did not write any letters and that Joe must be playing a trick on her. Meg was very upset. Joe was very angry. Joe looked at the letters again.
I think that Laurie wrote both these letters,
she said.
He is annoyed with me because I wouldn't share all of my secrets with him. Mr. Brooke knows nothing about the letters.
She went to get Laurie. Mrs. March talked to him for half an hour. Then the girls were called in, and Laurie said he was very sorry. He promised to do anything Meg wanted. Then they sent him home. Joe went to see him and found that he was in trouble with his grandfather. He would not tell his grandfather what he did or why Mrs. March had called for him to come. Mr. Lawrence was angry and shook him, but Laurie said he would not tell and went to his room. He would not come out. Joe went to his room and talked to him. Then she went to Mr. Lawrence and talked to him too. She told him that Laurie could not tell him anything because he had promised Mrs. March. In the end, Mr. Lawrence decided to forgive Laurie. Everyone tried to forget that Laurie had been so bad. Meg, however, began to think a lot more about John Brooke. Joe found a piece of paper on her desk with his name written on it many times. She threw it in the fire. During December, Beth and her father both got better. Mr. March wrote that he hoped to come home in the new year. Their Christmas this year was a lot better than the last. There were lots of presents, and Hannah was cooking a really lovely Christmas dinner. Mr. Lawrence and Laurie joined in. Everybody was very happy. They were even happier when Mr. March and Mr. Brooke suddenly arrived. It was a surprise for everyone. The girls hugged and kissed their father. Mr. Brooke somehow kissed Meg by accident. Beth came out of her bed and gave her father the biggest hug of all. They had a wonderful dinner, although the girls were all so excited that they ate almost nothing. They all talked at once. After dinner, Mr. March talked to his daughters. He reminded them that last Christmas was not a happy one, and that a lot of things had happened this year.
"This was a better Christmas,"
he said. He told them that he was very proud of them. They were all growing up to be very good young women. He noticed that Meg did not complain as often as she did. Joe was less like a boy than last year. Beth was not as shy, and Amy was not as selfish. They were all very pleased that he noticed these things. The next day, Laurie walked past the window and saw Meg sitting there. He went down on one knee in the snow and put his hands together for her. He looked like he was begging. Meg told him to go away. He pretended to cry.
What is he doing?
She asked Joe, laughing.
He is pretending to be your John,
answered Joe. Meg told Joe that she had thought about Mr. Brooke. She had decided to tell him that she was too young and that they should stay friends. Joe didn't believe she would say it. There was a knock on the door, and Mr. Brooke came in. Meg was suddenly very busy with her sewing. Joe left the room and Mr. Brooke spoke to Meg. He called her Margaret. She liked it. He said that he loved her and hoped that she could love him. Meg tried to say that she was too young. Mr. Brooke said he would wait. She looked at him. Suddenly she was frightened. She told him to go away and to leave her alone.
"Do you really mean that?"
he asked sadly.
Yes, I do,
she said. Mr. Brooke was pale now, and she began to be sorry for what she had said. Suddenly, Aunt March came into the room. She had heard that her nephew, Mr. March, was back home and had come to see him. She came into the house and surprised Meg and Mr. Brooke. She guessed what was happening and was very angry with Meg. She told her that if she married Mr. Brooke, she would leave nothing for her in the will.
None of my money will ever go to you,
she said.
You have a duty to marry somebody rich, who can help you look after your family.
Meg was very annoyed.
I will marry whomever I like,
she said.
And you can give your money to whomever you like.
Aunt March said that Mr. Brooke was poor and had no rich relatives. Meg said that he had good friends and that her parents liked him. Aunt March said that Mr. Brooke only wanted to marry her because he knew that she had rich relatives. Meg was furious.
He wants to marry me because he loves me.
Aunt March was even more furious.
Let his friends look after you then,
she shouted. She went home without even seeing Mr. March. Mr. Brooke was very happy. Now he knew that Meg did care for him. 15 minutes later, Joe came into the room and found Meg sitting on Mr. Brooks' knee. She rushed to her parents.
"Come quickly,"
she said.
"Mr. Brooke is behaving badly, and Meg likes it."
Mr. and Mrs. March talked to Meg and John all afternoon. By tea time, Mr. and Mrs. March agreed to let them marry. John Brooke hoped that he would have enough money in 2 years' time. Chapter 8. A Happy Wedding. John Brooke went to fight in the war. He was there for a year. Then he was wounded and they sent him home. He began working for Mr. Lawrence as a bookkeeper. He and Meg saved their money and in time they were able to buy a small house. Meg's friend Sally Gardner married Ned Moffat. They bought a very large house because both families were very rich. Meg wished that she could have a large house too, but when she saw John, she knew that she would always be happy with him. It didn't matter if it was a large house or a small house. Joe never went back to Aunt March. Amy went in her place. Aunt March paid for an art teacher for her, so Amy was happy to go and do the jobs that Joe used to do for her. This gave Joe more time to write. Beth was still not very strong after her illness, but she was always ready to help other people and still played her little piano. Laurie went to college. His grandfather was very happy. From time to time, he brought home some of his friends to meet the girls next door. Amy and Joe enjoyed these visits. They liked talking to the gentlemen from college. Many of the friends liked Joe, but none fell in love with her. They all fell in love with Amy. They wrote poems about her and talked about her when they were back at college. The house that John bought was small with a small garden, but he and Meg liked it very much. It was going to be their home. Everybody helped them to get it ready. They bought some furniture and cleaned and polished until it was ready to live in. People gave them presents. Aunt March had promised Meg that she would receive nothing from her if she married John Brooke. She kept her promise. She gave her sister, Aunt Carol, enough money to buy lots of presents for Meg and give them to her. The presents came from Aunt Carol, but the girls all knew who paid for them. They laughed about it every time Meg received another present from Aunt Carol. Laurie also helped by bringing a present every time he came home from college. It was a happy time for everybody. It took 3 years for John to have enough money, but at last the day came. Meg and John were to marry. Laurie came home from college.
"You'll be next,"
he said to Joe.
"No,"
said Joe.
"Nobody will want me. That's good because every family must have an old maid."
Laurie did not agree. The wedding was in June. It was a lovely sunny day. Meg looked very beautiful in her dress. Joe thought she looked as beautiful as a flower from the garden. It was a simple wedding. Aunt March came, and although she didn't agree with the way that Meg did things, she did enjoy it. The wedding was held in the Marches' garden, and everybody said it was lovely. There were lots of relatives and several friends, but it was not a big wedding. After the wedding there was a party, and everybody talked and laughed. Hannah had made a wonderful cake, and all the relatives and friends ate some of it. Aunt March danced with Mr. Lawrence. Everybody danced with Meg. It was a wonderful wedding and a wonderful party. John and Meg were very happy. Mr. and Mrs. March were very happy too. They were sad that their daughter was leaving home, but they were happy because she was happy. The small house was not far away, and John and Meg walked there at the end of the party. Everybody waved goodbye as if Mr. and Mrs. Brooke were going to Paris or Rome. Amy began to take her art very seriously. She tried different kinds of art. She went to art lessons with some other girls and became friends with them. One day she asked her mother if she could invite her friends to come and visit her. She wanted to give them a party. It would be expensive because all the other girls were rich and gave expensive parties. Amy promised to pay for it herself, but wanted her mother and sisters to help her with the work. She wanted the party to be for next Monday. Meg and Beth promised to help. Marmee and Joe thought it was a silly idea, but they promised to help anyway. Hannah also promised to help, although she was usually very busy with the washing on Mondays. Amy sent out invitations, and about 10 or 12 girls said they would come. The invitation said that the party would be on Tuesday if it rained on Monday. On Monday, everybody was busy getting things ready for Amy's party. The weather was sometimes good and sometimes bad. Hannah was busy doing the washing and cooked the food badly. Lots of things started to go wrong. It didn't matter because nobody came. On Tuesday, they did it all again. The weather was good, but the cake was stale. Only one girl came. They quickly put away a lot of the food and had a lovely party with just one guest. Amy was a little disappointed, but she did not complain. The rest of the family did not laugh at her. When the guest went home, the family ate as much of the food as they could. Then they took the rest to the Hummels. Amy thanked everybody for helping. Then she asked them not to talk about it for at least 1 month. Jo still wrote her stories. A few more were published in the newspaper. One day she went to a meeting. A boy there was reading a magazine that had a different kind of story in it. She read it. It was a very exciting story and very different from her own love stories. She didn't like it very much, but the boy said he did. He read all the stories by this author. He told Jo that the author made enough money to live on by writing these stories. Jo thought about this. She decided that if you want to make money by writing, you have to write stories that people want to read. She wondered if she could do that. The newspaper had a competition, so Jo decided to write something and enter it. She went home and wrote a story. She was very surprised a few weeks later to receive a letter from the magazine. She won the competition. She used the prize money to send Marmee and Beth for a holiday at the beach. They both returned a lot healthier and happier. Jo wrote some more stories. Then she wrote a novel. She sent it to several publishers. One of them agreed to publish it if she made it shorter. She talked about it with her family. They all had different ideas about what to do. She tried to do everything that they said and sent it back to the publisher. It was published. Some people said that it was very good, and other people said it was very bad. She was very confused. However, she was happy to receive the money. Chapter 9. Meg and Amy Solve Their Problems. Meg wanted to be a perfect wife. She wanted John to have a clean and tidy house. She wanted him to have clean clothes. John came home in the middle of the day for lunch. She wanted him to have good lunches. He came home every evening for tea. She wanted to smile for him when he came home. They were very happy in their small house. Meg learned how to cook. Sometimes she cooked too much and she would give it to her parents and sisters in the big house. Sometimes she would give it to the Hummels. John liked to come home to his small house and happy wife. She told him that he could bring home a guest for lunch. He didn't need to ask her first. She soon learned that this was a mistake. There were a lot of berries in her garden. She decided to make some jam. She worked hard all morning, but the jam was not right. This annoyed her. She was also very tired. John chose this day to invite a friend from the office for lunch. He was proud of his wife and house and wanted to show his friend that he had a happy life. He came home with Mr. Scott. There was a bad smell of burnt sugar. Meg was crying in the kitchen. He was very worried. When Meg told him that the jam would not set, he laughed. He thought it was funny.
"Is that all?"
he asked.
"Throw it out and I will buy you some. I've brought Jack Scott home for lunch and—"
A guest for lunch, and everything is a mess. How could you?
Exclaimed Meg.
You should have told me.
"You told me I didn't need to ask,"
said John.
"This is the first time I have done it. I will not do it again."
Please, tell him to leave. I haven't made any lunch,
cried Meg. John tried to be kind, but he still thought it was funny.
"Don't cry, Meg. I'll help you tidy up, and you can give us something to eat. We will have a good time. Just give us some bread and cheese. We don't need jam."
Meg thought he was cruel to continue talking about the jam.
You can tidy it up yourself and laugh about my jam as much as you like.
She went to her bedroom and stayed there. The two men ate some bread and cheese and went back to the office. That evening, Meg and John did not talk about the lunch or the jam. They did not talk at all until Meg went to John and kissed him. He said he was sorry for laughing at her jam, and soon they loved each other again. A few days later, Meg invited Mr. Scott for lunch and cooked a very good meal for him. They had such a wonderful time that Mr. Scott told John that he was a lucky man because he had such a lovely wife and home. Sally Moffat often came to visit Meg in her little house, and sometimes they went shopping together. Sally had much more money than Meg, and Meg was often envious of her. Sally could buy whatever she wanted. Sometimes Meg bought a few small things. They didn't cost much, but they added up. Then she did something terrible. She was in a shop with Sally, who was buying some new dresses. Meg wanted one too, but they were very expensive. She knew that Aunt March was going to give her $25 for the new year. That was 1 month away. The dress she wanted was $50. Sally offered to lend her the money. It was a beautiful dress. She didn't borrow the money from Sally. She bought it with the housekeeping money. As soon as she got home, she was worried. The dress didn't look very beautiful now, and $50 seemed like a lot of money. She had to tell John. He was very quiet.
"That's a lot of money,"
he said at last.
"but at least my wife will look as pretty as Ned Moffat's wife."
Meg was sorry.
I try to be happy,
She said.
but I'm tired of being poor.
This hurt John very much.
"I was afraid this would happen,"
He said.
"I will do my best."
She ran to him and held him.
I'm sorry.
She said. She began to cry.
You worked so hard. How could I say something so bad?
He forgave her and said no more about it, but she knew that she had hurt his feelings. He had ordered a new coat, but now he stopped the order.
"I can't afford it,"
he told her. That night, Meg cried herself to sleep. The next day, she visited Sally. Sally agreed to buy the dress from her. Then she went to the shop and got the new coat that John had ordered. When he came home that night, she was wearing it.
How do you like my new dress?
She asked him. He was very surprised and very pleased. They were both very happy. A few months after this, Meg and John became the parents of twins. The whole family was very happy. They called the boy Demi. They called the girl Daisy. Amy was still trying to be a lady. She asked Joe to help her make some visits to the families who lived nearby. Joe didn't want to do it, but finally agreed. Amy made a nice dress and said that she would tell her how to behave at each house. First, they visited the Chesters.
The Chesters are very serious,
said Amy.
so don't do anything unexpected or silly. Just be calm and quiet.
Joe was calm and quiet. She sat very still and hardly spoke. As they left, they heard Mrs. Chester say that she thought Joe was a very proud, unfriendly, and boring girl. Amy was annoyed with Joe.
We are going to the Lambs now,
she said.
Please try to be friendlier and talk to them. Be interesting.
Joe was interesting. She talked and talked. She told stories about Amy and other people. Amy blushed. Mrs. Lamb told Joe that she enjoyed her stories in the newspaper.
I'm sorry you couldn't find anything better to read,
answered Joe.
I only write that rubbish because it sells, and ordinary people like to read it.
Mrs. Lamb was not pleased. She did not think that she was ordinary. Amy was not pleased. She did not like the stories Joe told about her. They left as soon as they could. They made several other visits, and Amy became more and more annoyed with Joe. Aunt March was the last person to visit. Joe's dress was dirty from playing with children and dogs. Amy was still very clean and tidy. Aunt Carol was with Aunt March.
Are you helping at the fair?
asked Aunt March.
Yes, I am,
answered Amy.
It's a lot of work, but it is kind of Mr. Chester to invite me to help. It is a favor, and I am thankful for it.
Joe should have kept quiet, as she learned later, but she could not stop herself.
I don't like people doing favors for me,
she said.
I would rather do things my own way.
The two aunts looked at each other. Aunt Carol asked Amy if she spoke French.
Quite well,
said Amy.
Because Aunt March lets me talk to Esther.
She smiled at Aunt March. Aunt March smiled at her and at Aunt Carol. Joe said that she could not speak a word of French.
I don't like it. It's a silly language,
she said. When the two girls had gone, Aunt March said to Aunt Carol,
You should do it. I will give you the money.
I will,
replied Aunt Carol.
If her parents agree.
The Chesters' fair was very important for the young ladies of the town. They all wanted to help at the tables. Amy was invited, but Joe was not. They gave Amy the art table, and she was very pleased. She worked hard to make it look nice. The Chesters' daughter, May Chester, was not happy with Amy. Amy's drawings looked nicer than May's painted vases. When the tables were ready, Mrs. Chester told Amy that she should now look after the flower table so that her daughter May could look after the art table. Amy was disappointed, but she did not complain. The art table was the best table, and she had made it very pretty. She made the flower table look nice too, but it was not as nice as the art table. It was a long and difficult day for Amy. In the evening, Mr. Lawrence sent some beautiful flowers from his garden. Then Laurie arrived with some of his friends, and they bought all the flowers. Amy's pictures were all sold at the art table. Amy and May talked to each other after the fair and became friends again. Joe thought that Amy had behaved very well. A week later, Mrs. March received a letter from Aunt Carol. She wrote that she was going to Europe next month and wanted Amy to go with her. Joe was very disappointed. She wanted to go to Europe too. Her mother told her what the letter said.
I was going to invite Joe,
wrote Aunt Carol,
but she said that she did not like people doing favors for her. She wanted to do things her way, and she couldn't speak any French.
Joe remembered what she had said and was annoyed with herself. It was very difficult for her to watch Amy getting ready to leave. Laurie was pleased for Amy. He told her that he would come and visit her if anything bad happened. He didn't know how soon he would have to keep that promise. Chapter 10. Life in New York. Amy enjoyed sailing across the ocean to Ireland and then to London. She drew lots of pictures and wrote letters to her parents and sisters. Her uncle and Aunt Carol and her cousin Flo were good to her. While they were all in London, they met Fred and Frank Vaughan, and Fred traveled with them to Paris and then to Germany. Amy remembered their picnic with Laurie. She liked Fred and decided that she would marry him if he asked her. He was also very rich. However, Fred did not ask her. He received a letter from England. His twin brother Frank was very sick and he had to go home. Joe and her mother were becoming quite worried about Beth. She often looked sad and didn't talk to her father as often as she used to. She cried easily. Joe wondered what was wrong. Beth was 18 years old now, and Joe thought that Beth may be in love with Laurie. She didn't speak to Beth about it, but she was very worried. What would happen to Beth if Laurie did not love her? Laurie had some girlfriends at college, but the friendships did not last long. Most people thought that Laurie loved Joe. He was becoming more serious. Joe realized that this might be true, but she did not love Laurie. She did not think that they would be a good husband and wife. She wondered what she should do. Her mother received a letter from her friend Mrs. Kirk in New York. Mrs. Kirk was looking for someone to help teach her children and to do some sewing for her. Joe decided to go. She would enjoy meeting some new people and seeing some different places. She thought that it would help her writing. Her mother agreed. Mrs. Kirk was very friendly and soon made Joe feel at home. She gave Joe a small room at the top of the stairs. Joe liked her room and enjoyed teaching the children. There were many people staying in the house with Mrs. Kirk. One of them was a German man called Mr. Bear. He was over 40 years old and taught German to the children. Joe saw him help a maid carry a heavy basket. She liked him. He was poor. He was not handsome or young. He wore comfortable clothes. He did not seem to care what people thought about him. His room was untidy. At meals he ate a lot of food and ate it quickly. However, everybody liked him. He was not married, and one day Joe saw him mending his own clothes. He and Joe became good friends, and Joe began to take German lessons from him. He gave her books, and she gave him some small presents too. Joe was happy with her work and with her new friends. She was very busy and saved some money. She decided that she would like to have more than enough money so that she could help Beth and her mother. She began to write again. After her novel, she had not written much, but now she wrote some more sensational stories and sold them to a magazine. She went to the office of the magazine and did not like the men who worked there. They liked her stories but made her change them. In her stories, people who did bad things were always sorry and became good people, and people who did good things were always happy. That's what they wanted her to change.
If people want a sermon,
They said.
they will go to church.
Jo was not happy about the changes, but they offered her money, so she agreed. However, she refused to have her name on them because she didn't like them. In fact, she felt ashamed of them and didn't want her family to read them. She realized that she didn't know very much about the world and began to read the newspapers to find stories of accidents and crimes. These helped her write the sensational stories that the publisher wanted. Mr. Bear, meanwhile, became a very good friend. He told her that she should study good, simple people and write about them. She decided to study him. She wanted to know why everybody liked him. She realized that he liked other people and helped them all the time. She discovered from one of the other guests at the house that he was an important teacher in Germany before he came to America. He never spoke about this, but Jo liked him better for it. He was very generous, especially towards little children. He always had time for them and gave them small presents. One evening, another friend invited her to go to a meeting. Several famous people would be there. Jo was very excited. However, when she met these people, she was soon disappointed. They were only ordinary men and women after all. She saw a famous poet eating much too quickly for a poet. She saw a novelist drinking too much wine. She saw another writer being too friendly with a girl at the meeting. A young musician talked about horses. They were all very ordinary. She could hardly believe it. She sat down in a corner by herself to think about this. Mr. Bear came to sit with her. Then she heard some very clever people arguing about the meaning of life. She couldn't understand everything, but she enjoyed listening. She understood that they were taking apart the world she knew and putting it back together without God. It was very interesting. She looked at Mr. Bear and saw that he did not like it at all. He wanted to take her to another part of the room, but she wanted to listen. She stayed where she was. Finally, someone asked him what he thought about it. He said they were all wrong and gave many good arguments to defend religion. Jo was very happy when she heard what he said. She agreed with him. A few days later, Mr. Bear came to give her a German lesson. The children had made a hat out of newspaper and put it on his head. He forgot about it and was still wearing it. Jo didn't tell him about it, and the lesson went on as usual. Finally, Mr. Bear discovered that he was wearing the hat and took it off. He laughed. Then he looked at it and saw that there was a sensational story on this page. He did not like sensational stories. He thought they were bad for children. He said that people should not write stories like that for young people. He did not know that Jo wrote stories like that.
Good young people should not see such rubbish,
he said. He threw it in the fire. Jo went to her room and thought about her stories. She didn't want the people at home or Mr. Bear to see them. She enjoyed earning the money, but now she thought that she was doing something wrong. She picked up all her stories and threw them in the fire. Then she wrote another story which was very moral, but nobody would publish it. She tried some other kinds of writing, but she wasn't happy. She decided to wait until she was older and had more experience to write again. At the end of winter, she told Mrs. Kirk and her new friends that she was going home. They were disappointed. She invited Mr. Bear to come and visit her, and he was about to agree. Then she told him that Laurie was about to finish college.
I would like you to meet him,
she said.
Is he your best friend?
He asked.
Yes, he is. I am very proud of him.
She suddenly remembered that Laurie might want to be more than a best friend and began to blush. Mr. Bear thought he understood this blush. He told her that he would not be able to come. Chapter 11. A Disappointment for Laurie. Laurie completed his studies at college. Everybody came to the graduation. Jo was worried. She thought that Laurie would ask her to marry him. She didn't want to marry him. She knew he would be disappointed when she refused. Jo was right. Laurie told her that he loved her. He said he had always loved her and could never stop loving her. She wanted him to stop talking, but he continued. He said that he was trying to be good enough to be her husband.
I wish I could love you and be your wife,
said Joe.
but I can't. I can't make myself love you. We would not have a good marriage. We would fight. You need someone to behave like a rich man's wife. I can never be that person because I cannot behave that way.
Lori thought that she might be in love with her German friend. She always wrote about him in her letters. She told him that Mr. Bear was a very good friend, but that she could not love him either. She said she did not love anyone.
You will find someone else to love,
she said.
One day, you will be thankful that I refused you.
I will never love anyone else,
exclaimed Lori.
I can't forget you.
You need a fine lady for your fine house,
said Joe.
I am not a fine lady. I am strange and different. We would disagree. I wouldn't like your friends. You wouldn't like my writing. I cannot live without my writing. We would be unhappy. We would wish that we had not married. It would be terrible.
Anything more?
asked Lori.
No, nothing more, except that I will probably never marry,
she answered.
You will always be my friend, but I will never marry you. Please believe me. It will be better for us both.
Lori was disappointed and angry. He went for a row on the river. Joe went to talk to Mr. Lawrence and told him what had happened. He was also disappointed, but he did not disagree with Joe. When Lori came home, his grandfather talked to him about Joe.
I want you to come with me to Europe for a while,
he said. Lori did not really want to go to Europe with his grandfather, but he agreed. He pretended to be happy that he was leaving, but Joe knew that he was not. She felt as if she had killed her best friend. She felt very bad, but she could not change it. She could not make herself love him. Beth did not look healthy. Joe was worried about her. She was pale and thin. Her eyes looked very sad, and she was very quiet. Joe wanted Marmee to take her to the mountains for a holiday. Beth did not want to go to the mountains. She wanted to go to the beach again. Marmee did not want to leave Meg and the babies, so Joe took Beth to the beach. They spent the whole time with each other. They walked along the beach, they rested, they read books. They did not talk about the illness. One day, Joe thought Beth was asleep. She looked at her. She was so thin and weak. Joe began to cry because she knew that Beth was going to die. Beth was not asleep, and they talked about the illness. Beth knew that she was going to die. She had known it for a long time. At first it made her sad, but now she was used to it.
Every day, I lose a little more of my health and life,
she said.
It is like the tide going out. Nobody can stop it.
Joe was very sad. She wanted Beth to get well again.
We will stop the tide,
she exclaimed.
God cannot be so cruel. He cannot take you away from me.
Beth was sad too. She did not want to die, but she knew that she would.
I don't think I was meant to have a long life,
she said.
I never made plans for the future. I never had any ideas about what I wanted to be when I grew up. I never wanted to go anywhere but stay at home with Father and Marmee. I have stopped being a child, and soon it will be time for me to go.
Amy is coming home in the spring,
said Joe.
I will make you well for her.
Don't hope,
said Beth.
It will not help us. It will only make us unhappy. I think the tide will go out easily enough if you help me.
Joe kissed her sister. Amy was enjoying herself in Europe. Lori met her in Nice at Christmas time. His grandfather was staying in Paris, and Lori traveled wherever he liked. He was also enjoying himself, but Amy noticed that he was different. He seemed more serious.
I often go to see my grandfather,
Lori told her,
and tell him about my adventures. He likes to hear about them.
Amy had a letter from her mother. Beth was sick. Amy wondered whether she should go home, but the letters always told her to stay in Europe and enjoy herself. Lori agreed.
It makes them happy to think of you being here,
he said.
You cannot do anything at home.
Sometimes Amy thought he was just the same Lori. He was like a brother. At other times he behaved differently. He seemed more like a man. He told her about his adventures in Greece, and she invited him to come to the Christmas party and dance. He agreed to come. Amy dressed up for the dance, and when Laurie saw her, he realized that she had changed too. She was older and more grown up. Many men wanted to dance with her at the party. Some of them were very important and rich men. She danced the whole night. She danced once or twice with Laurie, but spent most of the evening dancing with a Polish count. Laurie watched her and was proud of her. Meg enjoyed looking after the twins and was very busy with them. She was so busy that she forgot about John. John did not worry at first. He thought that everything would go back to normal quite soon. However, this did not happen. The children took his wife away from him. He began to go and visit his friend Jack Scott. Jack had married and lived nearby. John went there in the evenings and talked to them. It was more interesting than staying at home. Meg was too busy looking after the children. When Meg did talk to him, it was always about the children. He loved his children, but he was interested in other things too. At first, Meg was pleased that he went out. After a few months, she began to miss him. She didn't dare to ask him to stay home. One day, Mrs. March found her crying.
"What's the matter?"
she asked. Meg told her,
John is away all day, and now he goes away at night too. I want to talk to him, but he is never here. He is very selfish.
"So are you,"
said her mother.
"You were not there for him when he wanted to talk to you. You were always with the babies. Many young mothers make this mistake."
What should I do?
asked Meg.
"Make it a nice home, so that he does not want to go to the Scots,"
replied her mother.
"Ask him to help you with the children. They are his children too. I am sure that he will be happy to help."
Meg thanked her mother and tried to do as she said. It worked. John noticed that she wanted him to stay home and help with the children. He was very good with them. Meg always gave them what they wanted if they cried. John did not, and they soon stopped crying. Meg was surprised and pleased. Their home became a happy place again, and the Scotts came to visit them. Even Sally came to visit them because Ned was often away.
Your house is always so friendly,
said Sally. Chapter 12. Times of Sadness and Happiness. Laurie stayed in Nice for a month. He was tired of being alone and enjoyed seeing Amy. Amy was happy to see him too. They spent a lot of time together. They learned a lot about each other. Laurie liked what he saw in Amy, but Amy did not like what she saw in him. He was trying to forget Joe. He felt sorry for himself. He became lazy. Amy did not know that Laurie had asked Joe to marry him. She did not know that Joe had refused. She only saw that Laurie was lazy. One day he went with Amy to Valrosa, where Amy wanted to draw. It was a beautiful day. There were many flowers in the gardens. He asked her about her drawing. She told him that she liked to draw, but after visiting Rome, she decided that she would never be a great artist.
"Talent is not genius,"
she said.
"and hard work cannot make it so."
She told him that she had decided to marry Fred Vaughn if he asked her. He was disappointed.
"It is very practical,"
he said,
"because Fred is very rich. However, I didn't think you would like Fred enough to marry him. I am surprised by you."
She was annoyed with him and told him that he was lazy. He laughed at her. This annoyed Amy even more.
"You can do so many good things, but you waste your time doing nothing,"
she said.
"Joe would be very disappointed in you."
Laurie looked so sad that Amy guessed what had happened. She was very sorry. Then she told him that he should stop being lazy. He should do something that would make Joe love him. Then she showed him 2 pictures of him that she had drawn. One showed how he was now. He looked lazy and careless. The other showed how he used to look. He looked lively and exciting. He noticed the difference. That night he left Nice and went to Paris to see his grandfather. Amy was pleased and hoped that he would think about what she said. Laurie did think about what Amy said. He decided to do something that would make Joe love him and marry him. First, he tried to write a requiem, but that was too difficult. Then he tried to write an opera, but this was also too difficult. After going to an opera by Mozart, he decided that Amy was right. Talent is not genius, and you can never make it so. He stopped trying to be Mozart. He wrote to Jo and asked if she thought differently now. Jo replied that she did not. She was looking after Beth and did not want to think about love or marriage. She told him to look after Amy. Lori began to write to Amy, and she enjoyed his letters. Fred Vaughn came back, and he asked Amy to marry him. However, Amy remembered what Lori said and decided to refuse him. Amy could not understand why Jo did not love Lori because he was such a good friend. Beth grew slowly worse. They did not tell Amy. Beth's parents, Jo and Meg, all knew that she would die. They brought all her favorite things to her room, where she lay on her bed. They put some of Amy's drawings on the walls. They brought Beth's piano into the room. Father's and Jo's best books were there for her to read. Meg brought the babies to come and see her. Marmie's best chair was in the room. At first, Beth was able to sew some clothes and other things for the children of the town. However, she soon had to stop. She was too tired. She had a lot of pain. Jo stayed with her all the time. She often cried while Beth slept. She wrote a poem about her sister. It said that she was brave and wonderful. Jo wished that she could learn to be like Beth. Beth read the poem and was very happy.
"If I have been so helpful to you,"
she said,
"I know that my life was useful."
You have taught me about love,
said Jo.
"It is not easy to die,"
said Beth.
"but love makes it easier."
In the spring, Beth died. It was a very quiet death. The family was sad, but everyone was also happy that she had no more pain. Amy was in Switzerland when Jo wrote to her about Beth's death. Amy was very sad and wanted to go home, but Jo told her that she should stay there. It was too late to say goodbye to Beth. Lori was in Germany and he received the sad news there. He immediately went to Switzerland to comfort Amy. She was very pleased to see him, and they spent a lot of time walking and talking. Lori was no longer lazy. He walked, went riding or sailing, and read. He was always busy, but he always had time for Amy. One day they went rowing on the lake. They both realized that they loved each other.
"Let us always row together,"
said Lori. She understood what he meant.
Yes, Lori,
she whispered. After Beth died, Jo tried to be like her. She stayed home. She looked after her father and mother. She did all the little jobs that Beth used to do. She tried to make her home happy, though her heart was sad. It was very difficult.
I cannot live like this,
she told herself. She cried a lot. She cried because Beth was dead. She cried because she felt that she was alone. She received a lot of comfort from her mother and father. They talked a lot about how to live and how to continue living when somebody dies. Jo worked harder to be like Beth. Meg came to visit often, bringing the twins with her. Jo loved the children. She wondered whether she would be happy to have a husband and children too.
"Love, marriage, and children will bring out the best in you,"
said Meg. It would happen one day, but Jo did not think so. She still tried hard to look after her parents and be happy.
"Why don't you write stories anymore?"
asked her mother one day.
I don't feel like it,
said Jo.
And nobody wants my stories now.
"Just write to please yourself,"
said her mother.
"It always made you happy before."
Jo did. She wrote a simple story. Her family laughed and cried over it and made her send it to a magazine. Jo was surprised that they published her story and asked for more.
It is such a simple story,
she said.
Why do people like it?
It is because you wrote the truth,
said her father. Jo wrote more stories and sent them to the publishers, and she continued to find success. Amy wrote to her parents and family and told them that she and Lori were going to get married. Jo was pleased about it, although it did make her feel more alone. Marmee was pleased too. They talked about it together. Jo said that she did not love Lori, but she was lonely and wanted someone to love her. Of course, her family loved her, but she felt that this was no longer enough. Jo began to remember the time that she had spent in New York with Mrs. Kirk. She went to her room and looked at some of the books and letters that she had kept. She saw a note from her old friend, the German teacher, and wanted to see him. She lay on her bed and cried. Was she feeling sorry for herself, or was she beginning to understand love? Only time would tell. Chapter 13. People Coming Home. Every evening, Jo rested by lying on the old sofa for an hour. She didn't read then or write. She just rested and remembered. She realized that her birthday was coming soon. She would be 25 years old.
I shall be an old maid,
she thought.
My pen will be my husband and my stories will be my children. Perhaps I will be famous in 20 years' time when I am too old to enjoy it. I will be alone.
She felt sad. She thought that people were not kind to old maids. She thought they should be kind to old maids because old maids often suffer. As she was thinking about this on the sofa, she must have fallen asleep. Suddenly she dreamed that Laurie was standing there looking at her. He came close to her and touched her on the shoulder. Then she knew it was not a dream. He was there. She jumped up and hugged him.
Laurie, I am so pleased to see you. Where is Amy?
She is at Meg's with your mother. I could not get my wife away from there.
Your what?
Shouted Jo.
Did you get married?
Yes,
answered Laurie. He pretended to be a little boy in trouble.
We did, but we only did it once, and we will never do it again, I promise.
Well, whatever will you do next?
Cried Jo and sat down on the sofa. Laurie looked very pleased.
Well, that's an unusual way to congratulate somebody,
he said. Jo laughed. She was really very pleased. She told him so, but he could also see it in her eyes.
Tell me about it,
she said.
Why did you marry in Europe?
He told her that the Carrolls were about to go home. He and Amy were going to go home with them. Then the Carrolls changed their plans and decided to stay another winter in Europe. Mr. Lawrence wanted to go home, and Laurie had to go with him but did not want to leave without Amy. Aunt Carroll wouldn't let Amy go with Laurie and his grandfather. She said that Amy should travel with a woman until she was married.
So I solved everything by getting married before we traveled home,
said Laurie. They married in Paris and had a honeymoon in Valrosa.
Why didn't you write and tell us?
Asked Jo.
We wanted to surprise everybody,
replied Laurie.
Jo,
he continued,
there is something I must tell you. I still love you, but it is a different love now. I love you as a sister. You were right to refuse me, and Amy and I are very happy. Will you love me like a brother?
Of course,
said Jo.
But we are no longer children. This has been a difficult year, and I have grown old. Sometimes I am lonely.
You will never be alone again,
promised Laurie.
You can visit us as often as you like.
Jo smiled.
I wonder who rules your house,
she said.
We rule it together,
replied Laurie. Then Amy, Marmee, Father, Mr. Lawrence, Meg, and the children all arrived together. What a lot of noise they made. They talked and talked and talked. It seemed that they would never stop. Amy had been away for 3 years and wanted to tell them all about it in half an hour. They asked many questions, and they all laughed together at the funny stories they told each other. Marmee was very pleased for Amy, who looked very well and healthy.
Love is good for her,
she told Father.
You have been her example,
he replied. The twins were 3 years old now and enjoyed playing with their new aunt and uncle. The new aunt and uncle enjoyed playing with them too. It was a very happy family that sat down to tea that evening. After tea, there was a knock on the door. Jo opened the door and thought she was dreaming again. There stood Mr. Bear. She was very pleased to see him. She made him come in and meet the family. It did not take long for Mr. March to like the German teacher. Mrs. March soon liked him too. Laurie and Mr. Bear looked at each other strangely but were friendly enough. The children were soon sitting on his knees and searching his pockets and pulling his hair and beard. Jo sat and watched. Mr. Bear was dressed better than she had ever seen him before. Suddenly she realized that he might want to ask her to marry him. Before Meg and John went home and everybody went to bed, they sang some songs around the piano. It was sad without Beth, but they all remembered her and sang beautifully. Mr. Bear sang some German songs for them. When Laurie and Amy left, Mr. Bear realized that Laurie was Amy's husband. He seemed very happy. When he left, Mr. and Mrs. March invited him to come again. Mrs. March guessed why he was there. She thought he was a good man and would be a good husband for Joe. Laurie guessed it too. When he and Amy were at home, he told her. She agreed.
I wish he were younger and richer,
said Laurie.
It doesn't matter,
said Amy.
What woman would marry for money?
I have heard of girls who think they will,
laughed Laurie.
Joe is certainly not one of them,
laughed Amy.
If they loved each other, money does not matter. I would have married you even if you've been poor,
she said. Laurie and Amy hoped that Mr. Bear would ask Joe to marry him.
If she does marry him,
said Laurie,
we will find a way to help them with some money.
Amy agreed. The twins were growing very quickly. Demi the boy was already learning to read. His grandfather was teaching him by using his body to make the letters of the alphabet. Daisy, the girl, was already learning to sew and cook. They were only 3 years old. Everybody who met them loved them. Demi liked making things and asking his grandfather questions.
What makes my legs work?
He asked one day.
Your brain makes your legs work,
explained his grandfather. A few days earlier, Demi had asked about clocks. His grandfather had opened a clock and showed him how it worked. Now Demi said,
Open me so that I can see me work.
His grandfather tried to explain that you cannot open people to see how they work. His grandmother was worried that the little boy was thinking too much.
If he is old enough to ask questions, he is old enough to have true answers,
said Mr. March.
Where is your brain?
He asked Demi. Demi thought for a moment.
In my stomach,
he said. Everybody laughed. Daisy loved to be hugged and kissed. She was a very happy little girl.
I love everybody,
she said one day. And truly everybody loved her. Mr. Bear stayed in the city for a few days doing some business. He did not explain his business, but he came often to see the family. Mr. March thought that he came to see him, but Mrs. March knew the real reason for his visits. Chapter 14. Joe Finds Happiness. Joe went for a walk every day, and every day she happened to meet Mr. Bear. He was also going for a walk, so they walked together. By the second week, everybody knew what was happening, but they all pretended they didn't know. Joe seemed very happy. She sang as she worked, and she tried to make herself look pretty when she went for her walk. After 2 weeks, Mr. Bear suddenly stopped coming. He stayed away for 3 days. Joe continued her daily walk, but she walked alone. She thought he must have gone home. She was annoyed because he didn't say goodbye. On the 3rd day, she was getting ready for her walk. She put on a nice dress and her best hat.
You'd better take your umbrella, dear,
said her mother.
It looks like rain.
Yes, Marmee,
replied Joe. Marmee asked her to get some things for her in town.
If you see Mr. Bear, invite him home for tea,
she said.
We have not seen him for a few days, and we miss him.
Joe blushed and turned away from her mother. She walked into town forgetting her umbrella. Why had her friend stopped visiting the house? Where was he? She looked in some of the shops. She hoped that she might find Mr. Bear, but she didn't see him. Then it started to rain. She was annoyed with herself because she had forgotten the umbrella. Her clothes and her best hat were wet. She ran across the road and a horse almost ran into her. Her feet were wet and dirty. She didn't know where to go. Then a man held a blue umbrella over her. She looked up and saw that it was Mr. Bear. He offered to help her with her shopping and carried her bags. Then she helped him with some shopping, and they bought some presents for Demi and Daisy. Mr. Bear said he had finished his business in town. Joe thought that he would go back to New York and began to cry. Mr. Bear saw her cry. She said she was crying because he was going away.
You are sad because I am leaving,
said Mr. Bear.
Have I found a place in your heart?
Joe nodded. He was very happy and asked her to marry him. She agreed. They walked home in the rain, getting very wet and dirty. They had many things to talk about. Mr. Bear said he had come to see Joe because he read one of her poems in a magazine. In the poem, Joe described herself as lonely and waiting for love. He hoped that he could bring that love to her. He did not come earlier because he was poor and could not offer her anything but a poor man's life. When he read the poem, he thought that he should try to make her happy. They did not marry immediately. Mr. Bear went back to New York to continue his teaching, and Joe continued to look after her parents. They wrote letters to each other and sometimes visited each other. Then Aunt March died. In her will, she gave Joe her house. It was a very large house, and Lori thought Joe would sell it and get a lot of money. Then she would have enough money to marry Mr. Bear and live happily in a small house. Joe, however, had other plans. She wanted to make the house into a school for boys.
There are so many boys who don't go to school,
she said.
Their parents are too poor. I want to start a school for them.
Joe was very excited. She spoke to Mr. Bear and he was very excited too. He said he would love to teach in such a school. Everybody agreed that it was a good plan. Mr. Bear came from New York and married Joe. They lived at Aunt March's house and began to teach. Mr. Lawrence and Lori found enough boys to go to the school and paid for Joe to look after them. Mr. Bear taught them. Joe enjoyed all the boys at the school. As the years went by, she had 2 boys of her own. It was not an ordinary school. The boys worked in the gardens and fields, as well as studying with their teacher and reading their books. Mr. Bear loved the children, and they all loved him too. He taught them and also played games with them. It was a very happy school. 5 years after the wedding, Joe and Mr. Bear held a big party at their school. It was Mrs. March's 60th birthday. Everybody was there. Mr. March and Mr. Lawrence walked around talking about books. Mr. Bear played with the children. Meg and John brought their children, who climbed in the trees with the other boys. Lori and Amy came with their daughter Beth. The girls had tea on the grass. Suddenly they heard singing. All the boys were in the trees like birds, and they sang happy birthday for Mrs. March. This was Mr. Bear's idea. Mrs. March was very surprised. The girls thought about the dreams they had when they were younger. Meg did not have lots of money, but she had a happy home. Joe did not have books and horses and had no time to write, but she was very happy with her school for boys. Amy did go to Rome, but did not become a famous artist. However, she was very happy because she could help Joe with the school. Their dreams did not all come true, but they were all happy. They thought that their lives were better than they had imagined so many years ago. Playlet. Coming home.
Lori, I am so pleased to see you. Where is Amy?
She is at Meg's with your mother. I could not get my wife away from there.
Your what? Did you get married?
Yes, but we only did it once, and we will never do it again, I promise.
Well, whatever will you do next?
Well, that's a strange way to congratulate somebody.
It's a big surprise, but I am very pleased. When did you do it? Tell me all about it. Why did you marry in Europe?
Well, the Carrolls decided to stay in Europe for the winter, but my grandfather wanted to come home. I had to go with him, but Aunt Carroll would not allow Amy to travel without a woman unless she was married. I didn't want to leave Amy there, so we decided to get married and then come home. Joe, there is something I must tell you. I still love you, but it is a different love now. I love you as a sister. You were right to refuse me, and Amy and I are very happy. Will you love me like a brother?
Of course, but we are no longer children. This has been a difficult year and I have grown old. Sometimes I am lonely.
You will never be alone again. You will visit us as often as you like.
Where is my sister Jo? Amy! Joe, I missed you so much. I missed you too, Amy. It is so nice to see you. Show me your ring. Are you angry? No, of course not. I am happy for you both. I think it is very good. I am sure you will be very happy.
Did you have a good trip?
Yes, it was excellent.
Where did you marry?
In Paris. It was a beautiful day, but I missed you all very much. We were very sad about Beth.
I am sure that Beth would not want to stop your happiness. It is sad that she is not here, but I think she is watching us now and smiling.
Yes, she could not smile often at the end because she had so much pain. But now all her pain is gone and we must be happy with her.
I would miss her very much. She played the piano so beautifully for me.
We will always remember her. But today we are happy to see the new Mr. and Mrs. Lawrence. Did you have a honeymoon, Laurie?
Yes, we had a honeymoon in Valrosa. That is where Amy was very angry with me and made me think about my life. That was a very important day for me.
And for me too. You were so lazy then. It was terrible.
Yes, I know, but you showed me what was wrong and I started to love you then.
Love can fix many problems.
Love is good for Amy. She looks very well.
You have been her example, my dear.
What are you going to do now that you are home?
I will become a businessman and work for my grandfather.
I thought you wanted to be a musician.
I tried to write some music while I was in Europe, but it was too difficult for me. I agree with Amy. She saw the art in Rome and decided that talent is not genius. She and I both have talents, but we are not geniuses. So I will be a businessman.
What about you, Amy?
I will make a home for my husband. We will have parties and dinners. I want to be a very good wife, and perhaps one day a very good mother. I do not need to be a great artist. I want to have a happy home, a happy husband, and happy children.
Those are good plans. I am looking forward to it.
Hello, my friend.
Mr. Bear, what a surprise. How wonderful to see you. Please come in. Look, everybody. This is Mr. Bear, my friend from New York.
Mr. Bear, we are very pleased to meet you. Joe has told us many good things about you. You are welcome in our house.
Mr. Bear, this is my very best friend, Laurie. You remember I told you about him in New York?
Yes, of course. How do you do, Laurie? I am pleased to meet you.
And this is my sister, Amy. She is his wife.
How do you do, Amy? You are his wife. Ah, that is very good. That is very, very good. I am very, very pleased to meet you both.
Today is a very happy day for me. I am with all my old friends again. You don't know how happy I am. This is all I need.